Hello everyone and welcome back to episode 9 of our series on painting A Song of Ice and Fire tabletop game miniatures, in which we've been painting Bronn the Mercenary, Jaime the Prisoner, and Cersei Lannister. This is the last episode of this season, and I'm very happy to be putting this together now, as when you're seeing this, I'm actually going to be on a trip for work. The week after this one comes out, I should be back, and I should be able to work on the usual sum up and en bref episodes that we saw after the last season, to sum everything up all at once. For now though, let's focus on finishing off these miniatures. There's not a whole lot left to do, so this is going to be a quite short episode, and it was actually just a quite short work period in real life. All we're going to be doing is touching up the metallic areas. We do the metallic areas after we've already applied our varnish, because we're applying a matte varnish to the miniatures. A matte varnish inherently takes away glossiness and shine from what's underneath, and since we want our metals to look shiny, we can't matte varnish them. Then it would just belie the point, really. So what I've done now is I've grabbed my Vallejo metals. In this case I'm going to be using both silver and gold, and I'm starting with silver, and I've put a little bit on my palette, and now I'm using one of my ratty old brushes. I've heard many people say never throw out a brush, and this is why. You can always use those ratty old brushes for stuff like your metallic paints. I've driven the metallic paint deep up in the bristles by sort of dabbing into it on the palette, and then I've wiped off a little bit of it. We're not quite dry brushing with it, because I don't want the brush to be fully dry. I want to be obviously still applying a significant amount of silver, particularly on the sword, for example, which is a large flat area, or the boss on Bronn's shield there. But we do want to make sure that we're not applying large globs of it, so we're not applying texture. Metallic paint's a bit different from your typical acrylic paint because it actually gives you this metallic texture by suspending little flakes, shiny flakes of a metallic substance inside the paint. So these shiny flakes can actually give a little bit more of a lumpy and thicker texture to the paint, and also if you thin the paint it can come out looking a little weird sometimes. So I prefer not to thin my metallic acrylics, and also just apply them this way, exactly as you see here, with a brush that's not quite dry brushing but not a super loaded brush either. And I always use an old tatty brush. If you start using a nice brush for your metallics, which absolutely you can, and in some cases I will do to get more specific details in smaller areas, what you'll find is the bristles are going to start getting bent out of shape, and the brush is not going to be in great shape afterwards. So you need to be sure to wash it really, really carefully and use something like a brush cleaner. I've got a brush cleaning and treating soap to condition the bristles and get them back into shape afterwards. Here I'm just taking advantage of the fact that I've wiped off most of the excess paint from my brush to just drag it lightly over the surfaces that I want to have silvered. In particular with the chainmail, the belt buckle, and the pommel of Bronn's dagger. They're all sitting on a different color, and obviously I don't want that color to become silver and shiny. So by making sure that we've wiped off the very tips of the bristles and gotten rid of any excess silver, we can be quite careful and just drag the brush over the high areas, just like we would do with a dry brushing, but obviously with a little more paint than we would normally dry brush with. In the chainmail here, you can see a little bit of an example of why we want to make sure there's not too much silver on our brush when we're doing these details. The chainmail really does show best if all of the crevices are left dark and all of the raised areas are the only ones that actually receive any silver. So here, having realized that I put on a little too much on that one arm and filled in a few of the rings, I've now wiped off even more of my silver onto my hand. Obviously you can wipe it off onto something that isn't a part of your body, and maybe that's preferable for you. But just try and monitor the amount of paint that you're putting on, particularly when you're doing very, very fine detail. Just like how earlier in the process we've been trying to make sure we don't fill in details by applying too thick paint. The same applies here, and in particular, like I said, with this chunky, thicker metallic paint, you do need to be very careful of that. The other thing you need to be careful of is the fact that while most of our other inks or paints actually wipe off or wick away quite cleanly from inks or paints that you may get them on top of, that isn't the case with metallic paint. Metallic paint kind of stains underneath. So while for most of this you've kind of been in very, very safe, in just roughly brushing everything on. While you're putting on your metallics, you're going to want to be a little more cautious. Especially after you put your matte varnish on, and if you, like me, are following on relatively quickly afterwards. Since all this was done in one morning, I didn't give, a full 24 hours for the varnish to set. I sort of let it set up for maybe half an hour at most. Technically the setting time on the bottle says 15 minutes, and that does feel pretty good to the touch, but normally I like to let my varnish set up quite a bit more. In this case I didn't. And in this case, you definitely are risking staining and sort of a change to the surface texture of your acrylics and your matte finish if you start getting the silver where you don't want it to be. So just be careful about that. That being said, it's not irrecoverable. The silver, at least in particular, is it's sort of bland. It's gray. If you take away the shine from it, right, the glittering of the metal, take that away, it's just a light gray, which is pretty unobtrusive. So if you take a little bit of your matte Mod Podge, the same stuff that we used for doing up the bases earlier and flocking them, if you take a little bit of that and just put a very, very thin amount over top of areas that you silver by accident, you may find that you can just cover it up and make it matte and it won't really show up very much anymore. Alternately, depending on the surface you're on, it could also just show up as a little scratch or nick if the surface could be metallic in some, scheme of things. For a lot of this fabric and wood, that won't work so well, but if you're doing something, for example, a little more science fiction with armor on a space marine or a battle mech or something, a little bit of metal getting out of the way doesn't matter so much because it's just chips in a paint job, right? So those kinds of considerations, obviously, you should keep in mind. But just try and be a little more careful with this than you would be with other colors. The next color that we're going to be putting on is a little bit of our Vallejo Gold. What ended up happening with this I'm a little less happy with overall. I actually sort of changed it later. Oh, this is actually a good point. The Vallejo Gold, I don't know why, it has like a milky medium with the gold flakes suspended in it. So you can see on the left, the first time, I hadn't shaken it enough, and it came out just milky white, which is useless. And on the right, you can see the medium has come out with some of the gold in, so when I use my brush, I'm going to mix it together a little bit as I put it on, and that'll apply fine. And in this case, I'm using one of my good brushes because I want to be reasonably precise with this. I'm doing trim on Cersei's dress with the gold. So I'm using a good brush, but I'm going to be very, very careful about cleaning it and conditioning it after. The concept that I had here was to try and get the gold trim, obviously, on the areas I'd left black, but also I wanted to see if I could detail her corset a little bit so she wouldn't be all just plain red all the way around, or, pink, because it's sort of sheer fabric, as it were. And also because my red ink doesn't really show up as bright red. And I think the trim went very well. The trim looks great as a little detail. But the extra stuff I add on afterwards, frankly, I just don't have a small enough paintbrush for really good freehanding, considering I've got really shaky hands and everything as well. And I'm not very practiced at freehanding. So what might have been a cool idea when undertaken by a more skilled painter didn't really turn out. That being said, later on, I did go back and just re-ink her whole dress, hit it with some more red, and that made the red A a little deeper than it is right now, which is great, that's fine. And B covered up the gold that I'll put on a little later in this episode, which I preferred the look of. Preferred the look of not having that gold on. I think that this just stands as another good example of how experimenting, even though I was kind of trying to speed paint these guys, experimenting is obviously still worth it, and you want to see what you can do with it, and you can recover almost anything. Much as I mentioned previously that your metallics can really stain onto acrylics underneath and matte areas, there's always the option of covering it up again, and that's exactly what I did. I covered it up, I mixed in a little bit of matte Mod Podge so that the next layer was at least a little bit matted down, and just covered up the details that I'd put on because I wasn't happy with them. Maybe later on, when I've got a steadier hand and then maybe a smaller brush, I might try this kind of detailing again, but without anything actually sculpted onto the miniature and without a great sort of idea in mind of what I wanted it to look like. You can see I'm sort of just feeling around and going, oh, okay, I don't know, where would the buckles be? What kind of trim would we have? Maybe I can get something that implies a floral pattern with some little dots. Yeah, obviously I'm just sort of winging it, and that showed in the final product. You've seen pictures of how Cersei turns out at the end of this tutorial, at the beginning and end of each of these tutorials, and in, I guess, 1/3 of the screenshots, or the thumbnails, roughly. So, I mean, if you liked it, you liked it. If you thought it was a little out of place, then you're not alone. So did I. That being said, totally recoverable, and I do recover it afterwards. I wouldn't really have changed what I did, because I think this brought to my attention a section of my skill set that I do need to work on, which is the small freehand designs. This is something I want to touch on a little later anyway, because I'm going to be working with some very, very small miniatures in the near future. I don't think I'm going to be trying to do shield designs for them, because it just seems like a lot of work, especially when you're doing large amounts of miniatures. But if I do want to do shield designs, obviously they'll come up, or banner designs, or if I get around to painting my Britannians, because I have a starter set of Britannians, then maybe I can work with that. So here you can see I'm starting to try and take it away. I think I've gone overboard, and I'm like, maybe take it away. Like I said, it stains the surface underneath. The metals don't come off very well. And so, despite me sort of reaching over, grabbing my flow improver, and now trying to wipe at it with another brush, a clean brush, not much is happening. So I'm going to come back to this. I'm going to keep scrubbing, but those little flakes, they get really good traction, and you just continue to get either it stays shiny, or you get a very clear, how would I phrase it? It's sort of like when you put a painting on the wall and then you take it off 10 years later and there's sort of an imprint on the wall. You get that same kind of imprint for the metals. So here I double down and say maybe I'll put more on and it'll look better, because over top of the red, the gold wasn't showing very well, particularly on the back. You can see it's a little patchy. Yeah, it didn't look great. It wasn't the best way to end off this little speed paint with an effect that I wasn't happy with, but it really didn't ruin the overall effect. I do think that Cersei, both before and after adding the gold paint that I added here, is one of my better miniatures that I've done so far. I'm really, really happy with how her base turned out, and she as a miniature was a bit challenging in terms of just trying to get something that looked really good with a dress, and I think if I hadn't been using ink washes, I would have struggled with it much, much more. I think I, like a lot of miniature painters, have gotten fairly used to painting gruff, big, beardy men in armor with swords, and painting a more plain, fine-featured, you know, woman or civilian even. I do have some civilians to paint, and I'll have to get around to them as well, but it's not as familiar, so it's more like wading into unknown territory. That being said, this is it. That's the end of these miniatures. They're finished off. They're good for the table. You can see there's a little bit of paint that's left to dry on them, but shortly thereafter, I was ready to put them back in the box and call it a day, get on to the next batch. So I hope you've learned something, and I hope you enjoyed following along here. I've seen that there's quite a few people who've been following along, and that's awesome. I'm up to 25 subscribers, which is crazy. I'm super happy with that, and I've gotten some comments from some people, some emails that say that you're really happy to be following along, and I've been able to help you with one thing or another, and I'm really happy to hear that. If you got any more comments for me, throw them down in the comment section below. If you'd like to use the same materials as I do, check the description. As an Amazon affiliate, I do earn from any purchases you make that are qualifying through those links. So, you know, if you want to support the channel and also get a hold of some of the materials I use that you can't find locally at a better price, then absolutely take advantage of that. And look out in the near future for another summary episode. That'll be a little more your traditional 15-minute all-in episode on how to paint the miniatures coming up in the near future. With all that being said, finally, thanks very much for watching, and go play some games.